Imagine being the boss of a thriving company, surrounded by loyal employees and a team that, on the surface, seems to be working together seamlessly. But what happens when the person at the top decides to take a step back and see things from a completely different perspective? What if the CEO of the company decided to swap their power suit for a simple uniform and blend in with the crowd, completely undercover? This isn't just a simple case of curiosity. It's a chance to see what really happens behind the closed doors of a workplace, to witness how employees behave when they think no one is watching. Meet James, a Black CEO who has built his company from the ground up. A visionary, respected by his peers and adored by his clients, James has always been proud of the success he's achieved and the team he's built. But over time, something began to gnaw at him. He'd heard rumors, whispers about office politics, employee dissatisfaction, and behind-the-scenes tension. Still, every time he held a meeting or checked in with his staff, everyone seemed to put on their best face, smiling, nodding, and assuring him that everything was fine. But deep down, he wasn't convinced. James knew he needed to know the truth, so he came up with a plan, a risky yet brilliant idea. What if he went undercover? What if, for just a few days, he put aside his CEO title, his fancy office, and his high-status meetings, and took on the role of someone entirely different? He chose a position that would give him a front-row seat to the pulse of his company, the receptionist. The receptionist is the first point of contact for anyone who enters the building. They're a face that greets visitors, the voice on the phone, the person who sets the tone for the entire office. To everyone else, they might seem like an invisible cog in the machinery of the business, but James knew that this role might just be the key to unlocking a wealth of information about what was really happening within his company. So, with a new name and a new identity, he slipped behind the desk and began his undercover mission. From the moment James sat down at that receptionist desk, everything changed. The interactions he witnessed, the conversations he overheard, and the way his staff treated him, he couldn't believe his eyes. The facade was starting to crack. Employees who once seemed dedicated were now showing their true colors, their frustrations and unhappiness slipping through the cracks. James had expected a few minor issues, but what he saw next left him utterly speechless. There were moments of kindness, yes, but there were also moments of shocking disrespect, blatant gossip, and even passive-aggressive behavior from staff members who had always seemed so professional when in his presence. And then there were the whispers, the comments about the company, about him, and about the decisions he'd made as CEO. Some of them were cutting, others were deeply troubling, and all of them felt like a betrayal of the trust he had worked so hard to build. But what truly shook him wasn't just what was being said. It was how little he actually knew about the people he'd entrusted to help him build his dream. People he thought were on his side, loyal to his vision, had very different thoughts about the direction of the company and his leadership style. As James listened, he realized that what he thought was a well-oiled machine was, in reality, a much more complicated and fragile ecosystem. Employees were struggling in silence, some feeling unheard, others feeling neglected. The lines between professionalism and personal opinions were blurring, and the trust between him and his team was starting to unravel. James felt a sinking pit in his stomach. This was not the world he had worked so hard to create. But as he listened more closely, he knew he had a choice to make. Was he going to confront these issues head-on and take action, or would he bury his head in the sand and ignore the cracks in the foundation? What he learned during those days undercover would change everything: his approach to leadership, his relationship with his team, and ultimately, the future of his company. And just as he began to piece together the unsettling truths about his business, the day took a turn he never expected. A conversation at the front desk would lead him into uncharted territory, revealing an even deeper layer of mystery than he ever imagined. The staff's secrets were only the beginning. As James' days as an undercover receptionist came to a close, he was left with a decision that could make or break everything he had worked for. Would he reveal his true identity and confront his employees, Or would he quietly step back into his CEO role, forever changed by what he'd learned? The answers lie in the moments to come, and they might just redefine everything James thought he knew about his company and the people he trusted most. Stay tuned. James had spent years building his company, shaping it from the ground up with a combination of hard work, visionary thinking, and a commitment to creating a positive and inclusive culture. He was proud of the brand he had cultivated and the team he had assembled, a group of talented individuals who were supposed to share his vision and help push the company forward. But now, sitting behind the receptionist desk, the reality was beginning to look very different. The office didn't feel like the supportive, energetic workplace he had worked so hard to create. It felt colder, more disconnected. The first few hours passed slowly. James had anticipated that the role of receptionist would be quiet and simple. But as the phone rang constantly and visitors came and went, he realized just how much of the company's flow depended on this single point of contact. There were dozens of people walking through the front door each day, employees, clients, and delivery personnel, and each one passed through the receptionist's desk. To them, James was just another face in the crowd. He was nobody special. It was the perfect cover. At first, everything seemed routine. He answered calls, directed clients to the correct meeting rooms, and made small talk with the employees who came through. Most didn't seem to notice anything unusual about him. A few glanced at him with mild curiosity, but no one suspected that the person behind the desk was the very CEO they had worked for, or at least that's what he hoped. But as the day wore on, small cracks started to form in the seemingly perfect image of his company. A few employees had let their guard down, forgetting that he was there. James overheard a conversation between two staff members, neither of whom knew he was listening. The first woman, Sarah, a senior marketing manager, was complaining to her colleague about the latest restructuring. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," Sarah said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Every week there's another change. And don't get me started on the new projects. We're expected to just keep pushing without any real direction. It's exhausting." Her colleague, a young man named David, nodded sympathetically but didn't offer much more than a few mumbled responses. He looked like he was avoiding the conversation, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. But Sarah wasn't done. "And honestly, it's James. He has no clue what we're dealing with down here. He's too busy in his meetings and his fancy office. Doesn't even know what the day-to-day grind is like for us." James' stomach dropped. The words stung, but it wasn't the criticism that hurt. It was the fact that Sarah felt this way and had no avenue to express it. She had no idea how right she was about his lack of awareness. He had spent so much time focusing on the big picture, on the clients and investors, that he had failed to stay connected to the people who were carrying out the daily tasks that kept everything running. As Sarah and David walked away, oblivious to the fact that their words had cut deep, James took a deep breath and tried to compose himself. This was only the beginning. He couldn't let his emotions take over. He needed to stay focused on the mission, understanding what was really going on behind the scenes. But it wasn't easy. Later that afternoon, another employee passed by, and James overheard a heated exchange between two team members, Mark and Jessica. They were sitting in the break room, discussing an upcoming project. Mark was visibly upset. "You're not hearing me, Jess. I'm telling you, I can't work like this anymore. I've been trying to get some time with James to talk to him about what we need, but every time I send an email, I get a generic response. There's no real feedback. It's like we don't even matter." Jessica, always the peacemaker, tried to calm him down. "Mark, it's not like that. You know how busy he is. He has a million things on his plate." Mark shook his head. "That's the problem. He's too busy. He's so far removed from the day-to-day grind that he doesn't see what's happening here. People are burning out. We're all doing the work of 5 people, and it's never enough." His voice cracked, frustration and exhaustion seeping through every word. James stood frozen in the hallway, unsure of what to do with the information he had just overheard. He had been so focused on creating a streamlined, efficient company that he had failed to realize the personal toll it was taking on his team. The pressure, the lack of feedback, the sense of being unheard, it was all starting to make sense. His employees weren't just frustrated with the workload, they were frustrated with the disconnect between them and the leadership. As the day came to an end and James settled back into his role behind the desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at play. It wasn't just about work dynamics or office politics. It was about trust, or rather, the lack of it. His employees didn't trust him, and more importantly, they didn't feel like he trusted them. But there was still one more piece of the puzzle he needed to uncover. There was an employee who had been a mystery to him from the very start, Kayla, his personal assistant. Kayla had been with the company for years, always efficient, always calm under pressure. James had never really thought much of her, assuming she was just another employee who got the job done without any drama. But something about her always seemed a little too perfect. Her smile was a little too practiced, her responses a little too rehearsed. It was like she knew more than she let on, and James couldn't shake the feeling that she had her own agenda. One day, during a slow moment, Kayla came to the front desk, carrying a stack of papers. She smiled politely at James, but didn't seem to recognize him as the CEO. "Excuse me," she said, "I just need to drop these off for Mr. Harris." James glanced up at her and nodded, feeling a strange sense of unease. There was something about the way she looked at him, like she was sizing him up, trying to figure out if he knew what was really going on. "Sure," James replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Just put them on the desk. I'll make sure they get to him." Kayla's smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered. "Thanks, I appreciate it." As she turned to leave, James watched her closely. Something in the way she carried herself made him think she wasn't just a personal assistant. She had a hidden depth to her, an understanding of the company that went beyond the surface. And it was at that moment that James realized he had no idea how much he had underestimated her, or how much she might know. The tension was growing, and every new revelation seemed to uncover another layer of the mystery surrounding his company. With each passing hour, James was feeling more and more like an outsider in a place he had once called his own. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how little he really knew about his team and the environment he had helped create. What had started as an innocent undercover mission was beginning to feel like an uncharted territory full of uncomfortable truths. What was Kayla hiding? What was Sarah's real opinion of him? And why was Mark so desperate to speak with him, but never able to get through? As the days passed, the questions only seemed to multiply. And James knew that soon he would have to make a choice, whether to confront his team with the truth or let the secrets simmer beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. The clock was ticking, and the stakes were higher than ever. James sat at the receptionist's desk, his mind racing as the day wore on. Every conversation he overheard seemed to reveal another crack in the polished image of his company, another sign that things weren't as perfect as he had once believed. The morning had been full of small, unsettling moments, the offhanded complaints, the weary faces, the constant murmurs of discontent. But it was the afternoon that brought something entirely unexpected. Kayla. She had been an enigma since the start, and now, watching her from behind the desk, James couldn't help but feel the weight of something unspoken hanging in the air between them. She moved with a calm, deliberate grace, but there was something behind her eyes, a hidden agenda, perhaps, or maybe it was just the sense that she knew more than she let on. As she passed by again, her smile faltering only slightly when their eyes met, James felt a sharp sense of unease. He didn't know what it was, but there was something about her that didn't sit right. Her role as his assistant had always seemed routine. She kept things running smoothly, answered calls, managed his schedule. Essentially, she was his right hand. But in these past few days, as James observed her interactions with others, he began to see subtle signs of tension in her demeanor. She was always the first to appear calm, collected, and professional in the face of any challenge. But was it a facade? As the clock ticked closer to the end of the workday, James caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach tighten. Kayla was speaking to one of the senior staff members, Jonathan, in the hallway. The conversation was quiet but intense. Kayla's tone was measured, her words deliberate, as if she were carefully choosing what to say. Jonathan, usually a man of few words, was nodding more than usual, his face unreadable. James couldn't make out the exact words, but he could sense the tension in the air. After they parted ways, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. What was so important between Kayla and Jonathan? He had always considered Jonathan one of the most reliable and loyal employees in the company. To see him so engaged in conversation with Kayla, especially in such a private manner, made James wonder if he had missed something crucial. Had there been a shift in the company's dynamics that he hadn't noticed? Was there some hidden power play going on behind the scenes? Just as James was about to dwell on this, he noticed Mark walking past the desk, his eyes darting nervously. Mark, who had been one of the employees venting his frustration earlier, seemed to be avoiding eye contact. He was walking quickly, almost as if he didn't want to be seen. Something was bothering him, but what? Why was he so desperate to speak to James, yet so fearful of actually doing so? The idea of a conversation with Mark began to linger in James' mind. He had to know what was going on behind the closed doors of his company. But how could he approach Mark without revealing his true identity? It would be a risk, but perhaps it was one worth taking. If Mark truly felt like he had no voice, maybe this was the opportunity he needed to speak up. The next day, James decided to take a different approach. He hadn't yet managed to engage Mark in any meaningful way, but he knew that he had to get to the root of the problem. He wasn't sure how much longer he could sit behind the receptionist's desk without completely losing his grip on the situation. He had to act quickly before the tension in the office reached a breaking point. It was nearing the end of the day when Mark finally approached the desk. He was holding a coffee in one hand, his eyes cast downward as he walked toward James. For a moment, he seemed unsure of himself, hesitant to break the silence. James took a deep breath, fighting the urge to reveal himself too soon. He had to keep his cover intact for a little longer. "Hey, Mark," James said casually, keeping his voice neutral. "How's everything going today?" Mark seemed to flinch at the sound of the voice, his eyes flicking up to meet James' gaze. He paused for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether or not to say something. James could see the struggle in his eyes, the fear of speaking out, the desire to vent, but also the uncertainty of where it might lead. It's been a long day," Mark finally muttered. He sounded exhausted, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the day was bearing down on him. "A lot of pressure, you know." James nodded, trying to make the conversation feel natural. "Yeah, I get it. It's tough out there sometimes." Mark took another step closer, glancing around as if making sure no one was nearby. "It's more than that," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going. The work's piling up, and no one's listening. I tried reaching out to higher-ups, but it's like we don't even exist." James' heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. Mark's words were the confirmation he needed. His team was frustrated, feeling invisible, unheard by the very people who were supposed to lead them. But there was more. There had to be more. "Have you spoken to Kayla about it?" James asked, his curiosity piqued. He wasn't sure why he asked her name specifically, but something about her involvement in the conversation with Jonathan the other day made her seem like a key player in whatever was unfolding. Mark's eyes widened, and for the briefest moment, James could see a flicker of fear in his gaze. "Kayla, she's not the problem. The problem is—" He hesitated, looking over his shoulder again, clearly worried about being overheard. "It's the way things are going. The changes, the promises that never come through. We all feel like we're just working for nothing." "Do you think it's just a few people, or is it everyone?" James pressed, trying to get more insight into the situation without drawing too much attention. Mark looked at him cautiously. "It's hard to say. I mean, not everyone will admit it, but I've seen it. People are starting to talk, and it's not good. People are leaving the company, or at least thinking about it. They're not happy, and the more they stay, the more it feels like we're stuck. The weight of Mark's words settled heavily in James' chest. He was hearing the same thing over and over from different people: frustration, disillusionment, a sense of being trapped. His company, the one he had worked so hard to build, was unraveling at the seams. He had been so focused on the big picture, on expanding and growing, that he had neglected the heart of the business, the people who made it all possible. As the days dragged on, James found himself sinking deeper into the web of secrets that seemed to be pulling the company apart. Every conversation, every overheard complaint, seemed to further solidify the growing sense of unease inside him. His initial goal had been simple: to understand the true dynamics of the office, to see things from the ground level. But now, as he watched his employees go about their work, their faces no longer held the same trust they once did. They were guarded, distant, and all too aware of the growing tensions that seemed to hang in the air. Mark's words from the previous day echoed in James' mind. Asterisk people are starting to talk, and it's not good. Asterisk. James could feel the weight of those words, but it was the unease in Mark's voice that really struck him. It was clear now that there was something bigger happening, something more than just office frustration or stress. There was a sense of betrayal, of people being pushed to their breaking point, and James knew he had to find out what was truly going on before things got worse. The mystery surrounding Kayla continued to eat at him. After his conversation with Mark, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow at the heart of everything. She had been the constant figure, always there, always in control. But what if she was hiding something more than just her professional demeanor? What if she was playing a larger role in the unrest he was witnessing? The way she had spoken to Jonathan in the hallway, the strange calm she exuded even when others were falling apart, it all pointed to something more. But what? He couldn't ignore the feeling that he was being watched. Every step he took, every move he made, seemed to be under the scrutiny of those around him. Even though he had taken on the guise of a receptionist, there was something in the air, a constant, subtle pressure, that made him feel like an outsider in his own company. It was as if his employees were no longer just working under him, but were waiting for him to crack, to reveal his true identity, and maybe even to apologize for the cracks that had started to form in the foundation of the company. One afternoon, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't keep sitting idly behind the desk, waiting for more whispers or glimpses into the fractures beneath the surface. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door, and he looked up to see Kayla standing there. Her expression was unreadable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She didn't need to ask why he was still here. The air between them had thickened with unspoken questions. "James," Kayla finally said, her voice steady but laced with an edge of something James couldn't quite place. "I need to talk to you. In private." There was something in her tone that made his pulse quicken. It wasn't the casual request he was used to from her. No, this was different, urgent, almost. James hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Sure, Kayla, let's talk." He followed her down the hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the empty office. They reached a small, quiet conference room at the back of the building. The walls were bare, the lighting dim. Kayla closed the door behind them and turned to face him, her eyes sharp and calculating. She took a deep breath, as if deciding how to begin. "I know what you're doing, James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit him like a cold wave. His heart skipped a beat, and for the first time since he'd started this undercover mission, James felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't warm. "I know you're not really just the receptionist. I don't know why you're doing this, but I know you're hiding something." And the tension in the room thickened. James took a step back, unsure how to proceed. He had known that Kayla was sharp, but he hadn't expected her to see through his disguise so quickly. How had she figured it out? Was it something in his behavior? Or had she been watching him from the start, sensing that something was off. "You've been watching everyone," Kayla continued, her voice now tinged with a hint of frustration. "You've been trying to find out what's going wrong, what's going on with the team. But here's the thing, James, you're too late. You've already lost them." The words felt like a punch to the gut. James had spent so much time trying to piece things together, to make sense of the discontent he'd sensed in the office, but hearing Kayla's words made him realize just how much damage had already been done. He had been too busy, too wrapped up in his vision, to notice that the trust between him and his employees had already shattered. And now it was too late to fix it with a simple apology or a speech. "I tried to warn you," Kayla said, taking a step closer. "But you were always too focused on the bigger picture to see what was happening here." The resentment, the frustration, it's all built up over time. People feel unheard, like they don't matter, like they're just cogs in a machine. And now they're starting to talk. They're starting to realize they deserve better. James swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had been so consumed by the growth of the company, by the vision he had for its future, that he hadn't seen the cracks forming beneath him. He thought he was building something great, something strong, but now he could see that all he had built was fragile, held together by thin threads of trust that were quickly unraveling. Kayla wasn't done. "There's more, James. People are leaving. You might not see it yet, but they're planning to jump ship. And it's not just the employees at the bottom. Even some of your top people are starting to wonder if it's time to move on. They had enough." The weight of her words crushed him. How many people were ready to leave? How many of his top employees, people he had trusted, were already planning their exits? James felt his stomach churn. He had always been proud of his leadership, but now he realized that his greatest weakness was his inability to listen, to truly listen, to those who were closest to the ground. Before he could respond, Kayla took a step back, her expression hardening. "I'm not here to fix it for you, James. You'll have to do that yourself. But know this, the longer you wait, the worse it's going to get. People are fed up, and the only thing that's keeping them around now is the fear of what comes next." James didn't have a chance to speak before she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the empty doorway. Kayla's words had shattered whatever illusions he had left about his company. The tension was no longer just an undercurrent. It was the loudest thing in the room, and it was growing louder by the minute. Now, with the clock ticking, James was faced with an impossible decision. The truth was out there, and it was more brutal than he had ever imagined. But what could he do about it? How could he fix a broken system when the very foundation had been cracked beyond repair? Every second that passed felt like a countdown to the inevitable collapse. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. He had to act. But the question was, what kind of leader would he choose to be? The clock was ticking. James stood there for a long moment, the silence in the conference room pressing in on him. Kayla's departure left a bitter taste in his mouth, but it wasn't just her words that lingered. It was the weight of the realization. His company was falling apart from the inside out, and the very people he had trusted, the ones who had helped him build this empire, were now on the brink of walking away. He had a decision to make. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer, but the pressure of what came next weighed on him like an anchor. If he didn't act fast, the damage could be irreversible. The employees had lost faith in him, and even the strongest among them were on the verge of quitting. James needed to change things, but what if it was already too late? Just as he was about to leave the room, he was stopped by a sudden notification on his phone. It was a message from Jonathan, one of the senior managers who had always been loyal to him. Jonathan rarely contacted him outside of work hours, so the message stood out. *, we need to talk. It's urgent. Meet me in the back parking lot in 30 minutes. *. James felt a jolt of alarm shoot through him. There was something in the message that didn't sit right. Jonathan had always been reliable, one of the few people James felt he could trust. But this felt different. The urgency in Jonathan's message made his stomach twist. What was so urgent that Jonathan couldn't say it inside the office? And why now, when things were already on the edge? Without wasting time, James grabbed his coat and made his way toward the back of the building. His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle that had been unraveling around him. Jonathan's request felt like the final piece of the puzzle, but what was he going to say? Could it be that Jonathan was finally ready to tell him the truth? Or was this another sign that things were spiraling beyond his control? When James arrived at the parking lot, the air felt thick with tension. The area was dimly lit, and he could barely make out Jonathan's figure standing near the far side of the lot. As James approached, Jonathan turned, his face tight with concern. "James," Jonathan greeted him, but there was no warmth in his voice. "We need to talk, and you're not going to like what I have to say." James braced himself. He could feel the tension in Jonathan's voice, the unease that seemed to hang in the air between them. "What's going on, Jonathan?" James asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "What's happening in the office?" Jonathan glanced around, as though making sure no one was listening, before lowering his voice. "It's not just the employees, James. It's me. It's all of us." James felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Jonathan hesitated, clearly struggling with how to deliver the news. "There's been talk, serious talk, among the senior staff. They're planning a walkout. They don't want to stay here anymore. They're not willing to be part of this any longer." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He felt the air rush out of him as he processed what Jonathan was saying. A walkout. The senior staff, the people who had been with him from the beginning, the ones he had built the company with, were planning to leave. "But why?" James stammered, disbelief coursing through him. "Why now? What happened?" Jonathan looked down at the ground for a moment, before meeting James' gaze with an intensity that made his stomach drop. "It's you, James. It's everything you've been doing, the direction you've taken the company in, the changes you've made without listening to anyone. People are tired. They've been trying to make it work, trying to make you see it, but you've been too blind to listen. They've had enough. And it's not just the employees at the bottom. The managers are frustrated too. They don't believe in this anymore." James felt his world tilt. This was worse than he could have imagined. He had known something was wrong. But this? A walkout from the senior staff. That would be the death blow to everything he had worked for. His mind raced as he tried to process the enormity of the situation. If the senior staff left, the company would collapse. The trust that had once existed between him and his employees would be shattered beyond repair. "But why didn't you tell me earlier?" James asked, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt. "Why wait until now?" Jonathan exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "I tried, James, but every time we brought up our concerns, you dismissed them. You were so focused on the bigger picture, on growing the company, that you couldn't see what was happening in front of you. We kept hoping it would get better, but it only got worse. And now, it's too late." The weight of Jonathan's words crushed James. It was as if the foundation he had spent years building had crumbled beneath him in an instant. His mind was racing, trying to come up with a solution, but the more he thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. The walkout wasn't just about a few disgruntled employees. It was a complete breakdown of trust, a fracture in everything he had worked for. "You can still fix this," Jonathan said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of pity and regret. "But you're going to have to make some hard choices. You can't keep ignoring the people who matter. You need to face the truth, James. The company won't survive unless you change your approach. And fast." Before James could respond, Jonathan turned and began to walk away. "I'm sorry," he called over his shoulder, his voice tinged with sadness. "I really am, but I don't think you can fix this now." James stood there, alone in the parking lot, his heart pounding in his chest. His entire world was unraveling. The company he had built, the empire he had fought so hard to create, was on the verge of collapse. And the worst part, he hadn't even seen it coming. The silence of the parking lot felt suffocating, and as James stood there, it became clear to him that the choices he had made, His ambition, his neglect of the people who mattered, had led him to this moment. The people who had once believed in him, who had been by his side every step of the way, were now turning their backs on him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But what if there was still a chance? What if, somehow, he could turn things around? The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. But James knew one thing for sure: time was running out, and if he didn't act fast, everything he had worked for would be lost forever. James stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing through 1,000 different possibilities, all of them leading to the same grim conclusion. His hands shook, and the weight of everything he had worked for, the years of effort, the sacrifices, the long nights, seemed to crumble in front of him. The company was on the edge, and no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he could feel the ground slipping away. But something in Jonathan's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, you can still fix this. Asterisk, James hadn't given up yet. He couldn't afford to. There had to be a way to salvage the company, to rebuild the trust that had been lost. It was clear that he couldn't do it alone, but if he could somehow make his employees see that he was willing to listen, truly listen, maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. James made his way back inside the building, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. There was no time to waste. He needed to speak to his employees, to those who were still there, still willing to give him a chance. The walkout was imminent, but he had one final chance to prove himself. One chance to show that he wasn't the out-of-touch CEO they had come to resent. As he entered the main office area, he noticed the tension in the air. It was palpable, like a storm about to break. His staff moved quietly, their faces etched with frustration, disappointment, and something else he couldn't quite place. It was as though they were all waiting for something, a sign, a message from him, that he had finally come to understand what was happening. They were waiting for him to prove he wasn't the same man they had grown frustrated with. James took a deep breath and walked up to the front of the room, where he could see his team gathered, whispering amongst themselves. He hesitated for a second, unsure of how to begin, but then he thought of Jonathan's words. Asterisk, you have to change your approach. Asterisk, it was time to be honest, time to lay everything on the table. Everyone, I need your attention, he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward him. I know what's been happening. I know things have gotten bad, and I'm the reason for that. The room stayed silent, but James could see the subtle shift in their expressions. They were listening. He could feel their eyes on him, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just the CEO. He was one of them, someone who had failed them, but who was finally ready to admit it. I've been so focused on the big picture, on the growth and success of this company, that I lost sight of what really matters, each and every one of you. I pushed you too hard, asked too much, and failed to listen when you needed to be heard. And for that, I am truly sorry. The sincerity in his voice hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, to his surprise, Kayla, who had been so distant for the past few days, stepped forward. Her eyes were hard, but there was something softer in her expression than before. James, he said, her voice quiet but firm. This company isn't just about you, it's about all of us. And if you really want to fix this, it's not just about what you say now. It's about what you do next. You have to prove to us that you can change. We need to see that you're committed to listening, to making this a place where everyone feels valued. Not just the ones at the top, but every single person who makes this company run. James nodded, the weight of her words sinking deep into him. He had always believed in the importance of vision, of growth, but he had failed to see that it was the people who built that vision who made it possible. He had neglected the very heart of his company, and now he had to fight to rebuild that trust. I'm going to start by listening, he said, his voice resolute. From now on, I want your feedback. I want to know what you need, what you want, and what you think we can do better. I will not make decisions alone anymore. This will be a team effort, and I won't stop until we get it right. There was a long pause, and James held his breath, waiting for their response. Would they believe him? Would they take his apology, this promise, seriously? The room was still, but then Mark, one of the senior managers who had seemed the most distant, stepped forward. "You've got one shot, James," Mark said, his voice low but not unkind. "Don't waste it." James nodded. "I won't." As the room began to fill with a tentative sense of hope, something shifted inside James. For the first time in days, he felt a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: optimism. He had a long way to go, and he knew that one speech wouldn't fix everything. But it was a start. Just as James was about to speak again, the door to the conference room slammed open. He turned to see Jonathan standing there, his face pale, his expression tight with panic. "James, we've got a problem," Jonathan said, his voice strained. "It's worse than we thought." James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart pounding. Jonathan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "There's been a leak. Someone from the inside has been sharing company secrets with our competitors. They've been feeding information about our upcoming projects, our financials, everything." The room went dead silent. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. The last thing he needed was this: a traitor in their midst. "Who?" James demanded, his mind racing. "Who's behind this?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment before answering, his eyes flickering with unease. "Kayla." The shock hit James like a tidal wave. He felt his breath catch in his throat as he turned to Kayla, whose face had gone white as a sheet. Her eyes were wide, and for a moment she looked almost terrified. The room was still, every pair of eyes now on her, waiting for an explanation. Kayla took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped forward. "It's true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not what you think. I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice." James's mind was reeling. A traitor in his midst, his closest confidant, the woman who had kept everything running smoothly. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice tight with disbelief. Kayla's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, it seemed like she was about to crumble. But then, with a sudden, almost eerie calm, she spoke. "Because you left me no choice. You were so focused on growing the company, so obsessed with success, that you forgot what it means to lead. I did what I had to do to survive." James stood there, stunned. The walls he had carefully constructed around his company, around his leadership, were falling apart. And the last thing he had ever expected was that the person he had trusted the most was the one who had betrayed him. In that moment, everything he had worked for seemed to hang in the balance, teetering on the edge of destruction. But there was one thing he knew for sure: his journey wasn't over. This betrayal, this shock, it was the catalyst he needed to reshape his company, to reshape himself. But the question was, could he still hold on to what he had left? Could he fix this, or was it already too late? As the room filled with whispers and uncertain glances, James knew that this was only the beginning of the real challenge he now faced. The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead was more uncertain than ever. The room was heavy with silence after Kayla's confession. James could hardly believe what he was hearing. Kayla, the person he had relied on the most, had been the one feeding confidential company information to their competitors. It didn't make sense. But as her eyes met his, he could see the pain in her expression, the regret, but also something else, a hint of resolve. "I didn't want to do this, James," she said quietly, her voice shaky. "But the pressure, it was too much. You stopped seeing us as people and started seeing us as cogs in a machine. We tried to warn you, tried to make you understand, but you wouldn't listen. So I made the call." James felt a pang of guilt in his chest. The truth of it stung. He had been so wrapped up in the company's growth, in the idea of success, that he had lost sight of the very people who helped make it all possible. And now, standing before him, was the consequence of his own blindness. The room waited for his reaction, eyes darting from him to Kayla and back again. James could feel the weight of all those gazes. This was his moment. The moment where everything could either shatter beyond repair, or where he could take a step toward mending the broken trust. "I didn't see it," James finally said, his voice soft but resolute. "I didn't see how far I had pushed all of you, how much I had neglected you. I've been so focused on making this company bigger, on making it a success, that I forgot about the people who made it possible. I made this company about me and not about us, and for that I am truly sorry." Kayla's expression softened, but the tension in the room remained thick. James stepped forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've hurt this company, Kayla," he said, his voice firm, "but I know this wasn't something you wanted. And I know that if we're going to move forward, we need to be honest with each other. This betrayal, it can't be ignored. But it's not the end, not if we're willing to fix it." Kayla nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't expect forgiveness, James. I don't deserve it. But I want to fix this too. I want to make things right." James took a breath, glancing at the team behind him. They had been silent through the exchange, their faces unreadable. He knew he had to address them now. "Kayla was wrong, but she's not the only one who's made mistakes. We all have," James continued. "I've been so focused on the vision I had for this company that I stopped listening to the voices that mattered most. I failed each of you, and I want to change that." The room remained still for a long moment before Mark, the senior manager who had spoken earlier, stepped forward. "You've got a lot to prove, James. We've heard apologies before, but what matters now is action. We need to see change. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now." James nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "You will see it. Starting today, we're going to rebuild. I'm going to listen to all of you, no exceptions. This company won't just be mine anymore, it will be ours." The atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. The tension wasn't gone, but there was a flicker of hope. It was small, but it was there. It wasn't going to be easy. Trust wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, but for the first time in a long while, James felt like he was on the right path. Over the following days, things began to change. James made himself available to everyone, every department, every level of employee. He sat down with his staff, one-on-one, listening to their concerns, their ideas, and their frustrations. He spent time with the receptionists, the IT team, the marketing department. No one was left out. He held town halls, where employees could voice their opinions freely, without fear of retribution. And slowly, bit by bit, the walls between him and his team started to come down. Kayla, for her part, worked hard to rebuild the relationships she had damaged. She acknowledged her mistake and worked to make amends, offering her full cooperation in the company's efforts to regain the trust of their clients. She was no longer the star employee she once was, but she showed a level of dedication that spoke volumes. Her efforts weren't enough to undo the damage entirely, but they were a start. James also took steps to address the deeper issues within the company, issues that had contributed to the rift in the first place. He worked with HR to implement more transparent communication channels and ensure that every employee had a voice in shaping the company's future. He pushed for more employee wellness programs and paid attention to the work-life balance that had long been neglected. For the first time, it wasn't just about the bottom line. It was about creating a culture of respect and accountability. The company began to shift, slowly at first, but steadily. The walkout that had been feared never happened. Instead, many employees stayed, willing to give James a second chance, provided he proved his commitment. And though the road ahead was still filled with challenges, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that leading this company would never be the same again. The business world was always evolving, but now so was he. Months passed, and the company began to recover. There were ups and downs, and not every decision was perfect, but James had learned to value the input of those around him. The employees had become his partners, not his subordinates. They were no longer just working for him. They were working with him towards a common goal. Trust, once broken, was slowly being restored, piece by piece. Then, one morning, as James walked into the office for an important meeting, he noticed something different. The reception area, once cold and impersonal, now had a welcoming feel. There was a plant in the corner, a few personal touches on the desks. It was small, but it symbolized something bigger. People were starting to care again. Kayla was standing by the front desk, smiling as she greeted a visitor. James stopped for a moment, watching her. She had come a long way since that day in the parking lot. She was no longer the same person who had betrayed him, and he could see in her eyes that she had earned back some of the trust she had lost. As he continued down the hall to his meeting, James couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He had learned that leadership wasn't about power, it was about people. And while he had made mistakes, he was determined to do better. The company was on the right path now, but he knew the work was never truly finished. And as for Kayla, though things might never return to exactly how they once were, he realized she was a part of the company's future. She had learned, as he had, that change wasn't just about fixing problems, it was about growth. They had both come a long way. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, James believed that the company and its people could thrive.